Friday morning that people will stroll in as the time passes. First of all, I want to welcome all of you who have come from outside of FIU, some of you traveling quite far, to be with us at this very important event, which was planned well before I even dreamed that I was going to be interim director of LAC, but that I enthusiastically embraced. It is a crucial topic, a topic that is being addressed more and more, not only in terms of academia, but in terms of public policy. As ambassador to the OAS, U.S. ambassador to the OAS, Carmen Lomellin, will talk about. FIU is hosting a State Department OAS conference with some 75 individuals from the Caribbean, from judges and lawyers and police officers, social workers, medical personnel, who deal with this issue every day, from defending women every day, or we hope defending women every day. So it is a crucial topic on all fronts, the most important one being the front of women and their children. So it is my pleasure also to welcome you, because this has been a joint effort by the Center for Latin American Studies, the Department of History in particular, and because the Latin American Caribbean Center is part of the Miami Consortium with the University of Miami Center, we are sponsoring this. This is part of our Title VI from the Department of Education here in the United States. And we are becoming better known. We are just now starting our third year as a consortium. And our first speaker is a professor emerita of History and Human Development and Family Studies at the University of Urbana-Champaign in Illinois. She is Dr. Elizabeth Peck. She has edited 9 books about the history of American families, a subject that sometimes politicians bandy about as if they all had the monopoly on what is good for our families. She is a specialist on 20th century U.S. women's history, in the history of women and gender in this country. Her most recent books are Not Just Roommates, Cohabitation After the Sexual Revolution, and Love and Freedom, Black Women in Colonial and Revolutionary New England. So please welcome Elizabeth Peck.
Lights, the older technology, not the newer version. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Good, okay. I want to provide a general overview of my reading in recent literature about the history of domestic violence that has been written concerning areas outside of the global north. And brief biographical introduction to this review of the literature. In 1987, I published the first scholarly monograph on the history of domestic violence, and it was called Domestic Tyranny. And I traced the rise and decline in interest in domestic violence as a social problem in the United States from colonial times in North America to the 1970s. I was studying not the subject of domestic violence itself, but rather public interest and attention to the social problem of domestic violence. I found that the women's movement in the 1970s stirred most of the recent interest in this topic, but there had been concern about domestic violence going back to colonial times, in colonial New England, in fact. In North American colonial history, domestic violence was seen as a disturbance to proper household order. And then in the 19th century in the United States, domestic violence was seen as an issue of concern to temperance, women's suffrage, and what I would call law and order reformers. Since then, I have returned to the subject of domestic violence from time to time to read the new scholarship in the area. And in doing so, in 2007, my colleague Megan McLaughlin and I undertook to publish a special issue of the Journal of Women's History about recent writings in domestic violence, the historical studies. Most of the articles that were submitted to us and that we published in this edition of the journal concerned history of the domestic violence in the United States, Western Europe, or the Commonwealth countries. We had one article that at least went back in time and that concerned medieval Europe. But for the most part, the articles that we received and that we published concerned the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a certain logic here, since the battered women's movement began in the UK and the US in the 1970s, and as a general principle, scholarly investigation follows social interest in a topic. We received several submissions that concerned passage of domestic violence legislation in many countries since the 1990s, actually in the 1990s, where we tended to classify those as contemporary politics and put them aside. Instead, we pushed back our study of domestic violence to be earlier in time. Then, in the 1990s, many more articles and books were written about the history of domestic violence outside the global north. The internationalizing of the history of domestic violence began with Latin American history, sometimes in articles, other times in books. I suspect that part of the reason for this early interest was the fact that several feminist scholars had come across legal records, often of arrest, sometimes of ecclesiastical or civil divorce, that furnished evidence of domestic violence. Moreover, the topic of domestic violence seemed to resonate with major issues in Latin American history, such as the demise of the Spanish Empire and the birth of liberal republics, the high level of violence in many Latin American countries, the significance of honor culture, and of machismo. The growth of women's activism in Africa spurred the post-1990s interest in domestic violence there. As a result, several scholars have published important articles and a recent superb anthology, which I highly recommend, called Domestic Violence in Colonial and Post-Colonial Societies about Sub-Saharan Africa, with histories concerned with West and South Africa about equally. So too, a women's organization against dowry murders helped encourage historical investigation of domestic violence in India. The writing about them in the Middle East is in fact regional and religious history, because so much of the regulation of domestic violence was conducted under Sharia law and adjudicated by Qadi courts. So historical scholarship appears to be motivated by a desire to show an oppositional discourse within Islam that rejected wife beating. Chinese historical research examines both the impact of elite ideals about chastity among the common folk and of the modernization of family law during the Republican years. In taking all of these different regional histories together, the articles I have read that come from the period emphasizing years since 1990s can be found in anthologies, often in journals about the history of the family or in law journals, some monographs, and are written by historians, law professors, and anthropologists. There are a few comparative studies of domestic violence, and one of the authors of a forthcoming study of spousal murder and abuse in the law in Colombia, Mexico, and Spain is in our audience, and he's actually quite unique in that regard. Most writing about domestic violence is connected as a case study. The case study is so much emphasized because it is the starting place of a research project, often based on painstaking research and legal records, and because historians place such value on the importance of context, which usually means situating their explanations in relation to a time and a place. In fact, context is usually seen as something close to causation, in that the frame surrounding domestic violence is in fact used as the explanation for it. For example, the frame is honor and shame culture, and then the explanation for domestic violence is the existence of an honor and shame culture. There is an additional reason case studies predominate so much in this literature. Anti-imperialist feminist scholars such as Chandra Mohanty, have called for an end to studies that tended to homogenize the experience of what were called third world women. Their low status is then used as fodder to legitimize imperial intervention in non-Western countries and buttress Western beliefs in racial and cultural superiority. Mohanty proposed that the only solution to such difficulties was to insist on the importance of listening to the voices of women themselves and avoid excess generalization. This talk will analyze the relationship between the internationalizing of the history of domestic violence and new insights into the topic. So, how we think and write about domestic violence differently now that we have accumulated evidence about Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, India, and to a much lesser extent, China. First of all, this internationalizing suggests that there are basic structural determinants of the incidence of domestic violence. The study of the history of domestic violence always generates debate about whether the incidence is higher now because of norms of privacy that isolate and silence the victim, or less because of many centuries-long civilizing process that has made interpersonal violence less justifiable and less acceptable, accorded women education, the right to divorce, higher status, and posed self-control among men as a necessary antidote to open expression of anger and rage. The perennial problems with most criminal statistics, less so for murder than for other crimes, is that one can never be sure whether reported crime represents actual incidents or increased willingness to report, and whether statistics from one place and time are comparable to those from another. Historians cannot interview the dead. They can indeed conduct oral histories with the living, as in Heidi Tinsman's interviews with battered wives in Chile, alongside her reading of the criminal records. Still, the survey questionnaire of social scientists can do something historians cannot do. It can plumb the incidence of domestic violence in contemporary world populations, including ones that do not have a huge amount of written history. The World Health Organization survey of women in 11 nations, conducted in 2005, is the best study of comparative rates of prevalence of domestic violence. The study used field researchers native to the country to survey 24,000 women in rural and urban locations using a standardized questionnaire. They defined domestic violence as behavior within intimate relationships that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm, including acts of physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. Their study found the highest current lifetime rates of domestic violence were rural Ethiopia, with rural Peru coming in a close second. The lowest rates were in urban Japan. There are other countries in which the rates are also very high, as reported in less comprehensive surveys. Because Ethiopia was never colonized, the high rates there cannot be attributed to foreign control of the nation's territory and institutions. Attributes of a country and its culture that might seem to be related to domestic violence and would differentiate, say, rural Peru and rural Ethiopia from urban Japan would include status of women in ways connected to culture and custom, religion, urbanization, political representation, lack of access to legal recourses for women victims, early age at marriage, absence of reproductive freedom. Even more telling are the comparative surveys of attitudes towards wife beating in Ethiopia, as well as in Mali and Uganda. Researchers find nearly universal acceptance for wife beating under certain circumstances by both men and women in these countries. For example, an overwhelming majority of Ethiopian men and women will answer that wife beating is acceptable if a wife burns the food. But surely domestic violence is so taboo in urban Japan, so hidden that whatever these statistics are conceals the true extent of it. Even if the tendency to hide domestic violence was considerably higher in urban Japan than in rural Ethiopia, a questionable assumption itself, it would have to be concealed by a factor of 7 to make up for the differential in incidence between the two countries in this WHO study. The accumulation of such statistics about prevalence of domestic violence is a historical phenomenon itself. It's the result of the globalization of US-based social science measurement of domestic violence. Sociologist Murray Strauss at the University of New Hampshire developed a quantitative survey questionnaire of domestic violence, which he called the Conflict Tactics Scale. This was 1979. The scale made it possible to conduct surveys about the incidence of domestic violence in the United States and subsequently in many countries, and was used in modified form in the WHO survey. The UN adopted initial declarations against sex discrimination, but when it did so, violence against women was not